Hello dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Enjoy watching. It was a cold, stormy night in the small coastal town of Carrington. The wind howled with a ferocity that rattled the windows of the grand mansion perched precariously on a cliff's edge, overlooking the relentless waves crashing below. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was no less turbulent. Ethan Harlow, a brilliant architect known for his meticulous attention to detail, sat alone in his study. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the fireplace and the dim glow of a desk lamp. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes on architecture, art, and history, a testament to his sharp mind and refined tastes. But tonight, Ethan's thoughts were far from the books that surrounded him. His usually calm, calculated demeanor was overshadowed by a storm of emotions. He had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control, to plan every aspect of his life down to the last detail. Yet, all his careful planning had failed him in the one area he had thought most secure, his marriage. Elena, his wife of 10 years, had always been the picture of perfection. She was beautiful, with dark hair that cascaded in waves down her back and piercing blue eyes that had captivated Ethan from the moment they met. She was intelligent, charming, and fiercely independent, qualities that Ethan had admired. Together, they had built a life that seemed perfect from the outside, complete with a sprawling mansion and a social circle that envied their success. But all of that was a lie. Ethan had discovered Elena's betrayal not through suspicion or gossip, but through the cold, hard evidence she had carelessly left behind. It started with an email left open on their shared computer, an innocuous message that quickly spiraled into a web of deceit. Late-night texts, secretive phone calls, and hotel receipts stashed away in her handbag all pointed to one undeniable truth: Elena was having an affair. For weeks, Ethan had kept this discovery to himself, his mind racing as he meticulously planned his next steps. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he watched and waited, gathering more evidence, piecing together the timeline of her betrayal. He noticed every detail that he had once taken for granted: the way she would smile at her phone, the mysterious business trips that had become more frequent, and the new perfume she wore only when she left the house alone. But Ethan was not a man to react impulsively. He was patient, calculating, and knew that if he wanted to exact the perfect revenge, he needed to play the long game. He spent his nights in the study, going over his plan again and again, refining every detail until it was flawless. One evening, as the storm outside reached its peak, Ethan decided it was time to set his plan in motion. He had spent the past few weeks orchestrating a series of events that would bring Elena and her lover, Julian Markham, to the mansion. Julian was a man who thrived on danger, a thrill-seeker who had seduced Elena with his charm and reckless abandon. He was the antithesis of Ethan, spontaneous where Ethan was calculated, carefree where Ethan was disciplined. But Julian's recklessness would be his undoing. Ethan invited Elena and Julian to a business dinner at the mansion, under the pretense of discussing a lucrative real estate project. Elena, unaware that her secret was out, eagerly accepted the invitation. She saw the dinner as an opportunity to blend her personal and professional lives, to further entangle Julian in her world. The night of the dinner, the mansion was impeccably prepared. The dining room table was set with the finest china and crystal, the chandelier above casting a warm, inviting glow over the room. Elena had chosen her most elegant dress, a deep burgundy gown that accentuated her figure. Julian arrived in a tailored suit, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. As they sat down to dinner, the storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a banshee as the rain battered the windows. Ethan played the perfect host, his charm never wavering as he engaged his guests in conversation. They talked about the real estate project, the booming market in Carrington, and their shared interests. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle unease that Elena couldn't quite place. After the main course, Ethan suggested they retire to the grand parlor for drinks. The parlor was a magnificent room, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and a large fireplace that crackled with warmth. They sat in plush armchairs, sipping on expensive whiskey as the conversation continued. It was then that Ethan made his move. "I thought it might be fun to play a game," he said, his tone light and casual. Something to spice up the evening. Elena raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Julian, ever the thrill-seeker, grinned and leaned forward. What kind of game? Julian asked, his voice tinged with excitement. Ethan smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. It's a game I learned during my travels in Europe. It's called The Truth or the Dare. Elena's smile faltered slightly, a hint of unease creeping into her mind. She had heard of this game before, but the way Ethan said it made it sound more sinister than she remembered. The rules are simple, Ethan continued. We take turns drawing from a deck of cards. Each card will have a question or a dare. If you choose truth, you must answer the question honestly. If you choose dare, you must complete the task, no matter what it is. Julian laughed, clearly unfazed. Sounds like fun, he said. I'm in. Elena hesitated for a moment, but Ethan's calm demeanor reassured her. She nodded in agreement, though a knot of anxiety began to form in her stomach. Ethan retrieved a deck of cards from a nearby cabinet and placed them on the coffee table. The cards were old, their edges worn from use, and each one was marked with a cryptic symbol. Ethan shuffled the deck with practiced ease and handed it to Julian. You can go first, Ethan said, his voice smooth as silk. Julian drew a card from the top of the deck and turned it over. The card was adorned with a black serpent coiled around a dagger. Beneath the image was the word truth. Julian smirked and looked at Ethan. What's the question? Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The question is simple. What is the most unforgivable thing you've ever done? Julian's smirk faded as he considered the question. He was a man who thrived on taking risks, but even he had his limits. He glanced at Elena, who was watching him intently, and then back at Ethan. I don't know, Julian said, his voice uncertain. I've done a lot of things, but I wouldn't say any of them were unforgivable. Ethan's smile widened, and he leaned forward slightly. Are you sure about that, Julian? Think carefully. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware of the weight of the question. He glanced at Elena again, then back at Ethan. I suppose cheating on my last girlfriend was pretty bad, Julian said, trying to sound nonchalant. She was devastated when she found out. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Interesting, he said. But is that really the most unforgivable thing you've ever done? Julian frowned, sensing that there was more to the question than met the eye. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Ethan gestured for him to pass the deck to Elena. Your turn, Elena, Ethan said, his voice low and smooth. Elena took the deck with trembling hands and drew a card. The card she held was different from Julian's. It depicted a crimson rose with thorns dripping blood. Beneath the image was the word dare. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she read the word. She looked up at Ethan, who was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. What's the dare? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's smile was slow and deliberate. The dare is simple, Elena. You must confess your deepest, darkest secret. Elena's eyes widened in shock. She glanced at Julian, who looked as surprised as she was, then back at Ethan. I don't know if I can do that, Elena stammered. Some things are meant to be kept private. Ethan's smile never wavered. But that's the game, Elena. You agreed to the rules. You must either confess your secret or face the consequences. Elena's mind raced as she considered her options. She could feel Julian's eyes on her, waiting for her to speak. She knew that if she confessed her affair with Julian, everything would be over, her marriage, her life, everything she had worked so hard to build. But before she could make a decision, Ethan spoke again. Or, he said, his voice dripping with malice, you can choose to take the dare and leave the truth unspoken. But be warned, the consequences of choosing dare over truth can be severe. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the trap Ethan had set for her. If she confessed, she would lose everything. If she chose the dare, she had no idea what Ethan had in store for her. After a long moment of silence, Elena made her choice. "I choose dare," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan's smile widened, and he nodded in approval. "Very well," he said. "Your dare is to follow me to the cellar. There's something I want to show you." Elena's heart raced as she followed Ethan down the narrow staircase that led to the mansion's cellar. The stairs creaked underfoot, the sound echoing through the dark, damp space. Julian followed closely behind, his excitement tempered by a growing sense of unease. The cellar was cold and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The walls were lined with old wine racks, some still holding dusty bottles, others empty and decayed. At the far end of the room, a heavy wooden door loomed ominously, its surface scarred and weathered with age. Ethan approached the door and produced a large iron key from his pocket. He inserted the key into the lock and turned it with a loud, metallic click. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that descended even further into the darkness. "After you," Ethan said, gesturing for Elena and Julian to enter the passage. Elena hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the thought of what might happen if she refused pushed her forward. She stepped into the passage, feeling the cold stone walls pressing on her from all sides. Julian followed, his bravado fading with each step. Ethan closed the door behind them, plunging the passage into near total darkness. The only light came from a single, flickering torch mounted on the wall, casting long, eerie shadows as they descended further into the depths of the mansion. Finally, they reached the bottom of the passage, where another door awaited them. This one was even older and more foreboding than the first, its surface covered in strange, indecipherable symbols. Ethan stepped forward and placed his hand on the door, pushing it open with a low, groaning sound. The room beyond was unlike anything Elena or Julian had ever seen. It was a vast chamber, with walls made of ancient stone and a high, vaulted ceiling. The floor was covered in strange symbols, painted in what appeared to be blood. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate altar, its surface stained with dark, ominous marks. "What is this place?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Ethan stepped into the chamber, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "is where I've been preparing for this moment." Julian took a step back, his eyes wide with horror. "Ethan, what the hell is going on? What is this?" Ethan turned to face them, his eyes cold and merciless. "This is where you will pay for your sins," he said, his voice dripping with venom. Before they could react, Ethan reached into his coat and produced a small, intricately carved box. He opened the box to reveal a set of gleaming, silver tools, knives, needles, and other instruments of torture, each one carefully crafted for a specific purpose. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. This was no longer a game, this was revenge. Cold, calculated, and merciless revenge. "Ethan, please," Elena pleaded, her voice shaking with fear. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't do this." But Ethan's expression remained cold and unyielding. "It's too late for apologies, Elena. You made your choice, and now you must face the consequences." Julian, sensing the danger, lunged at Ethan, trying to wrestle the box from his hands. But Ethan was prepared. With a swift, practiced movement, he struck Julian across the face with the box, sending him crashing to the floor. "Julian!" Elena screamed, rushing to his side. But before she could reach him, Ethan grabbed her by the arm and dragged her towards the altar. "Ethan, no! Please, no!" Elena cried, struggling against his grip. But Ethan was relentless. He forced her onto the altar, binding her wrists and ankles with heavy iron chains. Elena struggled, tears streaming down her face as she realized the full extent of Ethan's plan. "Ethan, please," she sobbed. "I'm begging you. Don't do this." Ethan ignored her pleas, his face a mask of cold determination. He turned to Julian, who was still lying on the floor, dazed and bleeding. "Get up," Ethan commanded, his voice low and menacing. Julian struggled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, you don't have to do this. We can work something out." Please, just let her go." Ethan's eyes narrowed as he approached Julian, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can bargain with me, Julian? After what you've done?" Julian backed away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Please, Ethan. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Ethan's expression hardened, and he raised one of the silver knives from the box, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "Sorry won't save you now, Julian," he said, his voice cold as ice. Before Julian could react, Ethan slashed the knife across his chest, the blade cutting deep into his flesh. Julian cried out in pain, collapsing to the floor as blood poured from the wound. "Ethan, stop!" Elena screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. "Please, don't do this." But Ethan was beyond reason. He moved with methodical precision, each cut, each stab carefully calculated to inflict maximum pain without causing immediate death. He wanted Julian to suffer, to feel the full weight of his betrayal before the end. Elena watched in horror as Ethan tortured Julian, her mind reeling with the realization that the man she had once loved was capable of such unspeakable cruelty. She had betrayed him, yes, but she had never imagined that he would take his revenge in such a brutal, horrifying way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Julian's screams began to fade, his body growing weaker with each passing moment. Ethan stood over him, his expression cold and unfeeling as he watched the life drain from Julian's eyes. When it was over, Ethan turned to Elena, his face a mask of cold, calculated malice. "And now, it's your turn," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Elena's heart raced as she realized what was about to happen. She struggled against the chains, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out. But there was no escape. Ethan had planned everything, down to the last detail. Ethan approached the altar, his expression unreadable as he stared down at Elena. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, don't do this." But Ethan's expression remained cold and unyielding. "You made your choice, Elena. Now you must face the consequences." With that, he raised the knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. Elena closed her eyes, bracing herself for the pain she knew was coming. But the pain never came. Instead, there was a loud crash as the door to the chamber was thrown open, and several men in police uniforms stormed into the room, their guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of the officers shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. Ethan froze, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. He had been so focused on his revenge that he hadn't noticed the approach of the police. He had planned for every contingency, but this was unexpected. Slowly, Ethan lowered the knife and stepped away from the altar, his expression calm and composed. The officers moved quickly, surrounding him and placing him in handcuffs. Elena collapsed onto the altar, sobbing in relief as the officers freed her from the chains. They helped her to her feet, wrapping her in a blanket as they led her out of the chamber. As they escorted Ethan out of the mansion, he remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had been caught, but he felt no regret, no remorse. He had done what he set out to do, and in his mind, justice had been served. In the days that followed, the story of Ethan Harlow's revenge spread like wildfire through the town of Carrington. The details of the torture chamber, the meticulously planned execution of his plan, and the horrific fate of Julian Markham shocked the community to its core. Elena was taken to the hospital, where she was treated for shock and minor injuries. Physically, she would recover, but the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. She had lost everything, her marriage, her lover, her sense of security, all because of one foolish affair. Ethan was charged with multiple counts of murder, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. During the trial, his cold, calculated demeanor never wavered. He showed no remorse for his actions, no regret for the lives he had destroyed. In his mind, he had been justified in his actions. He had simply delivered the punishment that Elena and Julian deserved. The trial was swift, and the verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. Ethan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away from the courtroom, he remained calm. If you leave a comment, tell us what you think about the story you heard. It's important to us and will help us find and tell stories that you find interesting. Thank you for watching us.